Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Rami Al-Chalabi, and I'm the Head of the Assurance and Advisory Division at Chiming Australia. I'm very excited to moderate today's webinar on modern slavery. We have more than 70 attendees that have registered, which clearly shows that today's topic is of significant interest. I'll introduce our three speakers first: Kerry McGoldrick, Associate Professor Shelley Marshall, and Dr. Darian McBain prior to their presentations, and moderate the Q&A towards the end of today's webinar, and we aim to finish at 12:15. All attendees are on mute, but being on mute doesn't mean you can't ask questions of our panelists. We're using the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post your questions throughout the presentation. I'll collate those and put them to today's speakers in the Q&A. We're also running two live polls today. The first poll question will appear on your screen shortly and can be accessed at any time using the poll button at the bottom of your screen. Once you answer the question, it will disappear. We'll compile the results and share these with you at the end. Let's begin. I'd like to first introduce Kerry McGoldrick. Kerry is a partner at Chiming Australia in the Assurance and Advisory Division with significant experience in governance, risk, compliance, sustainability and supply chains. His expertise has been built through both hands-on experience in industry and also extensive experience in professional services advising multinational corporations. He headed the Enterprise Risk Program for the Woolworths Group in Australia and working extensively across the operations and supply chain of that business. In advisory, Kerry has led the Oceania service offering for third-party risk management, engaging across the region with multiple sectors and organisations to manage supply risks through complex organisations. He's a member of the ESG Working Group for the Financial Services Council, which is developing modern slavery due diligence requirements for member entities. On behalf of the Governance Institute of Australia, Kerry is a member of Risk Management Committee of Standards Australia. I'd also like to introduce our second speaker. That's Associate Professor Shelley Marshall, Director of Centre for Business and Human Rights at RMIT University. Shelley has undertaken empirical research in diverse countries, including Bulgaria, India, Indonesia, Australia, and Cambodia, and has published widely based on her findings. Her high standing as a scholar has been recognised through the award of a number of large multinational grants, and she has undertaken collaborations with scholars from Cambridge University, Harvard University, Melbourne University, and RMIT. Shelley's partnerships with International Labour Organisation, Oxfam, Core UK have enabled her to produce research of a highly applied nature, having a strong policy influence and providing meaningful lessons for businesses and organisations. Her leadership on the steering committee of the Australian Corporate Accountability Network has provided opportunities to influence business and human rights policy in Australia. And finally, our third speaker, Dr. Darian McBain, Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Thai Union. Darian is a globally experienced sustainability and communications executive. She's a world-recognised expert, speaker, and author on sustainability, supply chains, and business human rights. Thai Union Group is a multi-billion-dollar listed company and is the owner of retail seafood brands such as John West, Chicken of the Sea, and King Oscar, supplied to retailers and food services globally. Prior to joining Thai Union, Darian was Managing Director of the agency Blue Sky Green, the Director of Policy, Sustainability, Development Executive for the National Health Service, Purchasing Agency, and has been with the UN Communication and been with United Nations in Communications. Darian worked with WWF on market transformation for commodities such as palm oil and timber. So as you can see, everybody, we are an outstanding company. Kerry, can I hand over to you, please, for your part of the presentation?
Thanks, Rami, and good morning, everyone. In my comments today, I will cover three things. Firstly, provide background and context around the Modern Slavery Act. Secondly, outline the 7 mandatory criteria to be addressed in all modern slavery statements. And thirdly, to address some common questions businesses are asking about modern slavery. So, about the Modern Slavery Act. The Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act commenced in Australia on 1 January 2019, and some extensive guidance has subsequently been published as well. The Act created a modern slavery reporting requirement for certain entities operating in Australia, and the requirement is for those businesses to report on the risks of modern slavery in their operations and supply chains and the actions being taken to address those risks. So while the legislation is new, the risk is not. The Act aims to combat modern slavery in global supply chains, with the UN estimating there are approximately 40 million victims of modern slavery around the world. and it can occur in every industry and in every sector. There are two important threshold requirements in determining whether the Act applies to your business and therefore if you need to report. Number one is that your entity, and that's a very broad term, must have annual consolidated revenue of at least 100 million Australian dollars. So that's number one, 100 million AUD. Number two is that you must be an Australian entity or a foreign entity carrying on business in Australia. So if the Act applies, your organisation must do the following. A, prepare a modern slavery statement covering the financial year which addresses the 7 mandatory criteria, and I'll come back to those. B, ensure it is approved by the board or equivalent and signed off. And C, submitted to the Australian government for publication on the website it will be establishing. It's important to be aware of the relevance of the Modern Slavery Act to your business, even if you are not required to currently report. It is likely that you do business with organisations which do or will report, and they may well expect, as part of your commercial relationship with them, for you to demonstrate how you manage modern slavery risks in your business. And we're certainly seeing evidence of this in both public and private sector procurement processes. Should you wish, it's also possible to voluntarily submit a modern slavery statement. And as well, something to be conscious of is that similar legislation is in the pipeline in New South Wales, which may commence from next year, and it has a proposed lower financial threshold of $50 million revenue. So let me now touch on the timelines for reporting. The key requirement is to submit your approved modern slavery statement within 6 months of the financial year you're reporting against. With the legislation commencing from January 2019, this means all reporting entities are now within or have nearly completed the first year against which they must report. Please note that reporting dates for some organisations, those with a financial year ending before 30 June 2020, for those organisations, the deadline was extended by 3 months to allow organisations additional time to consider the impacts of COVID-19 on their operations and supply chains. So let's turn now to the 7 mandatory criteria to be addressed in all modern slavery statements. You'll see the 7 criteria on the slide. I won't read them out, but you will see at their heart, they require your organisation to describe how you identify, assess, and manage the risks of modern slavery and how you check and test the effectiveness of those actions. The starting point then is to understand and map your supply chain, and Shelley will cover this in more detail in her comments. I would say though that in our experience, this is best approached in a way that is integrated with or aligned to how you manage other business risks within your organisation's risk management framework. Bear in mind also that your modern slavery statement must also include 2 other things relating to its approval. The statement must be approved by the principal governing body, a defined term, of the reporting entity. And usually that's going to be the board or equivalent, depending upon the governance requirements for your entity. And the statement must also be signed by a responsible member of the reporting entity. And usually that's going to be a member of that principal governing body. So for instance, the chair or the chief executive. So finally, I'd like to share with you some common questions which are being asked, and there'll be plenty of time in Q&A today to ask others. First question we're often asked is, does the Act apply to our business? Well, while the Act creates the requirements, the interpretation is largely guided by the Australian Accounting Standards and the Corporations Act. If you're unsure whether your revenue or the nature of your entity is caught by the Act, please feel free to reach out for advice. Another common question is there a template we can complete? In short, no. The Act does require a common reporting framework, through the mandatory criteria, the 7 criteria we stepped through before, but the form of reporting is quite deliberately left as a matter for disclosure, which suits the context and the circumstances of your business. Another common question is, what are the consequences of non-compliance? The legislation in its current form does not include financial penalties. The main risk is reputational, as the government may name and shame effectively non-compliant businesses, and this may of course also impact your commercial relationships and the views and perspectives of your investors, consumers and other stakeholders. And also this, how far along to our supply chain do we need to look? Well, this too is deliberately not defined. Your immediate or tier 1 suppliers may not be sufficient, and you may need to look to your supplier's suppliers. The answer to this will really turn on where the risks lie for your business, and this will emerge from your mapping of your supply chain. So I'll close there. Thank you, and back to you, Rami.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks for that introduction. If you joined the webinar a little bit late, just a little quick reminder, we're running some live polling today. So the first question will have been on your screen. You can also access that by clicking on the polling button at the bottom of your screen, where you get to gather those results and share them with you at a later stage. Shelley, could I invite you please to give your presentation?
Thank you, and thanks for that great overview, Kerry. So I'm going to be speaking today on what we know about the way that statements have so far been made in the UK, where reporting has already been going on for a few years. So you can look to those as an example, and the Australian Act is largely modelled on the UK Act. But before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on the land of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present. Next slide, Kerry. Thanks for taking care of that. All right, so Kerry's already told you or pointed you in the direction of the guidance, and I really can't stress enough that that is a great starting point. That is really a lengthy and comprehensive set of insights with case studies and examples, but you can also look to statements that have been made in the UK in your sector if you want to get an idea of how you might present your statement. There is a public register, which I'll point to on the next slide. Start by knowing what modern slavery is. There is a quite specific definition that you'll find in the guidance. People often confuse modern slavery with egregious working conditions, and it's not quite that. So it's trafficking, child labour, bonded labour, forced labour. So it's at the very kind of worst end of the spectrum. However, as you can see in the box on the left-hand side of my slide here, it is often associated with bad or exploitative labour conditions. So it tends to be the kind of worst of the conditions if there are bad labour conditions occurring in your operations or more broadly in your supply chains. So knowing where your risks are is your starting point. And just to be clear, your statements are a report on your business's process. So it's not just about the report, it's about the process that lay behind the report. Thanks, Kerry. So you should start with assessing the risks within your business operations and supply chains. And again, the guidance provides a definition of what supply chains are. One of the strengths of the Australian Act and the guidance over the UK Act is that it better describes, for example, what a supply chain is for financial entities. So it does include any contracting in you get of financial services, if you're a financial entity. And just to highlight some of the risks that might be occurring in the sectors that you're from. For financial services, there is evidence of human trafficking being linked to money laundering, and we've seen in the controversy around money laundering and the failure of financial entities in Australia to get on top of that, that could be a considerable risk. But also banks and financial entities lend to such a wide range of business entities that the exposure across different sectors is really large. In construction, I've been, I carried out for a number of years research of stone quarrying. So a lot of the stone that's sold within Australia has been mined with child labour, bonded labour in particular. And if you have operations outside Australia as a construction operation, then there's a big risk that migrant workers will have gone into debt bondage just in order to get the job. Education, last year there was actually it was a little bit covered up, but there was a finding of modern slavery within the cleaning services of an Australian university. And I actually have a conversation piece that came out today, which covers the labour conditions that are commonly found in cleaning supply chains in Australia. And many of you will be familiar with the controversy around agricultural practices in Australia. So any business which is bringing food into the business, or in particular that's in food retail, has exposure to risks of bonded labour in Australian agricultural supply chains, but these practices are quite common across globally in agriculture. I've provided a few useful links as starting points here for you to just kind of have a look at what the main risks are in different sectors. Thanks, Kerry. So a good starting point is to identify what the high risk areas are for your company. And develop a process that's specific to your business, as Kerry has already said. So the worst statements are written by lawyers. They're one page. They state that there's very little exposure to risk. And the best map out a process that will be adopted across all operations and supply chains in the coming years. And I can tell you that some of the very best companies that I'm confident will come out as best case scenarios from the Australian process are not trying to map their entire supply chains or work out what the risks are across all of their operations and supply chains now. They're starting with the highest risk ones and being strategic about it. So when this process started in the UK 3 years ago, I provided a rating that was given the average score for FTSE 100. And you can see that the starting point was pretty low. We have the benefit in Australia of being able to look to what's already happened in the UK where entities have reported and learn from that. And I want to just highlight a few of the lessons now. Thanks, Kerry. So best practice in the first year in the UK, companies started by mapping their supply chains. And as anyone who's doing this work will know, most companies don't actually have a good idea of who all their contractors are, and in particular, beyond the first tier of their suppliers, who's supplying to their suppliers. So Unilever provide an example of best practice in the first round of UK statements. They developed an integrated human rights strategy. So the Modern Slavery Act and the guidance is based on a human rights due diligence process. There are fantastic guides available about how to carry out a human rights due diligence process. And I think Darian will be speaking to what her company did in developing their own process. And the best practice companies also engaged with workers extensively. And there are many ways to do that. Best practice is carrying out worker-led monitoring programs, for example, and ensuring that there's freedom of association throughout your operations and also in your supply chains. Next slide. So worst practice, well, Olivia Dean, who's online, and I have just 2 weeks ago published an article looking at the reporting that has been carried out by Australian financial entities under the UK Act, and the report card wasn't great, but it does show really fantastic signs of maturation. So the biggest problem is that the entities started by reporting on their kitchen and stationery supply chains, whereas they should have been reporting on the impact of their lending practices and their suppliers, the financial products that they buy in, which of course is an extensive practice. The hotel sector rated extremely badly as well, particularly because they didn't address the recruitment and debt bondage, which is common, particularly outside of Australia for any hotel chain that has operations outside of Australia. But again, any sector that there's cleaning being carried out in, these practices of debt bondage are also seen in Australia. Next slide. And the biggest oversight across all sectors in the UK was that most did not report a process for providing remedy in situations where the entity caused or contributed to modern slavery. So there are many ways that you can set up processes for remedy. There are whistleblower programs and whistleblower protection. You can have hotlines. There are many different ways that you can set up grievance mechanisms, for example, where you can hear about and address complaints of modern slavery or instances of modern slavery. And that often will mean trying to fix the situation and also provide compensation where necessary. But most of all, and this is the key purpose of the Act, is your process should result in change across your operation. And if it doesn't, then the statement is really for naught. The whole purpose of the Act is to encourage operational learning across the biggest companies in Australia, and that hopefully will also result in change throughout the supply chains of our most influential businesses. So your human rights due diligence process should lead to a process where you remedy problems where you find them, and where there is a kind of high level buy-in and change throughout the business as a result of what you find as you look for risk within your business and within the supply chains of your business. I'll leave it there, and I'll really look forward to fielding questions that you might have about specific sectors or about the processes that you're entering into.
Great, thank you very much, Shelley. Quickly, if you have any questions you'd like to post, quickly reminder, you can use our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, Darian, could I please ask you to come and present on your insights into modern slavery? Thanks.
Thank you, Rami, and thank you, Kerry and Shelley, for your presentations. It really does highlight how the example that I'm going to give brings this to life and puts it into practice. So I work for Thai Union, which is one of the largest seafood processors in the world. And that means we don't have vessels, we don't have farms, but we process fish, whether it's wild capture or aquaculture, all across the world. So you can see we have factories in Thailand, in Africa, in the US, throughout Europe. Really is a very global spread. We have brands throughout the world, not in Australia, I might add, although we do supply to Australian retailers. So where we will come in contact with the with the Australian Modern Slavery Act is through our customers, being the large retailers and some food service business, will ask us for our input into their Modern Slavery Act statements. Although the size of our business means that we do report under the UK Modern Slavery Act, and our first statement that we published, it was, I think, 12 pages long. So we went for a very extensive approach rather than a shorter approach. And we also report under the US California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. So this means that if you look at this map, you can see we're kind of everywhere. We have global supply chains. And really, I'd say throughout the 2000s, much as you hear in Australia, a lot of the campaigns were to do with environmental sustainability. Are there going to be enough fish left in the ocean? Kerry, if we could go to the next slide. But then in 2014, The Guardian wrote an article on slavery at sea in Thailand. And what they wrote about was what they called ghost ships. So the ships that were staying off the coast of Thailand, they were fishing, that fish was transshipped or transferred into other vessels that came back into Thailand, where that fish was processed and turned into fish meal, that got turned into shrimp feed, and then that fed the shrimp or the prawns that then were sent around the world. And that was the real first alarm saying, wait, there is something major going wrong in Thailand to do with modern slavery. And this is where working for a company where the name is Thai Union in a country called Thailand, most people didn't really distinguish between the two, even though a country is not a company and vice versa. So in 2015, we had kind of the worst of all scenarios happening. So you had that Guardian article, but then you also had Associated Press writing about it, the New York Times. So I can tell you, I'd been in the job, I joined in July 2015, and I'd been in the job 1 month. And I was coming back from meetings in the UK, which is where the head of our John West brand is, and sitting in an international, well, a UK airport, and picked up the international New York Times. And there we were on the front cover, an article by New York Times in Avena called Sea Slaves. Now, in that case, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you agree or disagree with what's written. It's your reputation that's on the line. And so we had the international media focus. We had very active NGOs, particularly local human rights-based NGOs. There were multiple US lawsuits going on at the time on forced labor, and they were mainly naming the retailers, but we were further down in that supply chain of those who were supplying to the retailers, also to some of the pet food supply companies. You had a government that was in transition. And so don't ever think this is all just about trade. At the time, the Thai government, it was a military government, and they had a coup in 2014. And so the US and Europe had actually suspended official negotiations with the government. And so the only way they could really influence was through trade. And the US Trafficking in Persons report, which is another source of information to look at, we found that Thailand was downgraded to tier 3, which is the lowest tier. And you also had from the European Union what was called an IUU yellow card. So that's using soccer term of a yellow card, a warning card on illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And that was the European Union saying to Thailand as a country, if you don't improve your regulation of fisheries, then we'll give you a red card, which means you can't export your products. But what it also meant for a company like Thai Union is that people thought the yellow card was on us. And all of that led to very angry customers. Here, if you go to the next slide. And these are some of the things that you started to see. These are the headlines. Ripping Up the Sea was a big billboard in San Diego in the US, where one of our big offices is, and that was sponsored by Greenpeace. I can tell you, unless you've lived through a global Greenpeace campaign, you don't know just how bad it is having activists scaling your walls, throwing fake blood everywhere. It was constant. They even dyed the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok green as a part of their protest campaign. The Associated Press report, it was syndicated here in Australia as well, although the reporting was slightly different to what the original report was. But certainly that's a time when Thai Union did hit the news in Australia. And so what do you do when you are absolutely really under the hammer all over the world? I think the only thing you can do is move forward. So if we go to the next slide. So from the end of 2015, we developed our sea change strategy, and we talk about changing seafood for good. Now, I won't go into all the details of sea change, although I'm very happy to share with you more information after this, but really putting human rights and workers at the heart of it was very important. So you see in the top one of the overarching objectives, making sure that workers are safe, legally employed and empowered. And that picks up on a few things that we heard from Shelley about worker voice being the empowerment, making sure that they had legal documentation, that they were being treated fairly, and that they had safe places to work. And then if you look down into the programs, one of the key programs, and indeed one that I'm most often speaking about, is safe and legal labor. So that's all around the human rights piece. And then under that, you've got our operating principles. So good governance. So if I give an example, I report directly to the CEO. I'm on our risk management committee. I'm on our global leadership team. I am the corporate representation of our approach on human rights. Transparency, and then partnerships and collaboration. Next slide. Now, we didn't go straight to this process, but it really does show that it's not about writing just a Modern Slavery Act statement. So we have this whole human rights due diligence framework, and within it, you've got our commitment to human rights, the assessment of the risks, so analysing where the risks sit, what processes do we need to put in practice to change and to prevent any human rights abuses occurring or occurrences of modern slavery, detection, remedy. I mean, that was brought up again by Shelley. This is a very important part. If you find something, and really you do want to find what's happening in your supply chain, how will you take action? And so when you put all of these together, that is the entirety of the program. The Modern Slavery Act statement for us is really just writing up that whole process. You can't have the statement without all of this really that goes behind it. And so I would advise when you're starting out in this process, think of what else you have in practice. And Kerry, final slide, please. And I think something else to keep in mind, and this is perhaps easy for us, is you're really thinking about people. Make sure that you put people at the heart of what you're doing. So these are the workers in one of our shrimp plants in Thailand. As you can see, full PPE. We are actually in a good position when COVID hit that already our workers had to be very well looked after and wearing the appropriate equipment. But if you think of these are people whose lives you're trying to impact, to make sure they get a wage, to make sure that they are in a fair employment circumstance, to make sure that they can communicate with their families, that they can raise grievances and have those addressed. That is ultimately, where the Modern Slavery Act should be taking you. So if you take that worker-centric approach, I think you're less likely to go wrong. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been an honor to speak to you today, and hopefully we'll have some more questions after this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Darian, and thank you to all our speakers. While they ready themselves to come up onto the virtual stage, perhaps a little quick reminder to the audience. We're about to launch our second poll. You can still answer the first poll question if you haven't, but we're about to launch that second one. It should be on your screen very shortly. Once you answer that, it will disappear from your screen. So speakers, ready yourselves. We've got some good Q&A that's come through. I might start first, Kerry, an easy warm-up question for yourself. The question goes, it's an organisation that has an annual reporting period for 31 December. So what would be the first period or first year that that organisation needs to prepare its modern slavery statement, and when is it due?
Sure, Rami. So the first year for an organisation with a December reporting date, a balance date, would be June 2021. Bearing in mind that you're halfway through, the first reporting period is this current financial year, December 20, with the statement due 6 months from the end of the financial year. So as I say, by 30 June 2021. I would just add that care needs to be kind of pushing it down the road too far for two reasons. Firstly, you're reporting against current reporting period, and so currency of information is important. And also, you'll be half through your second reporting period if you kind of leave it too long. So getting started means just thinking through what your approach and strategy will be in order to meet that requirement, but bearing in mind Darian and Shelley's comments that you're reporting or disclosing on what you are doing and the processes underlying how you manage these risks of modern slavery. But in short, for December, June 2021 is the submission deadline.
Thanks, Kerry. Another one, Darren, we'll perhaps put this next question to you, and then Shelley and Kerry, you can sort of make some comments. Darren, the question is, what is a reasonable scope for an organisation to report under? So in effect, how many layers down through the supply chain should an organisation go to as part of compiling the statement? So for example, if they were purchasing merchandise, do they look at the person that they're immediately purchasing from, or do they ultimately go to the underlying manufacturer?
Thanks, Rami. That's a really good question. And for us, we took a risk management approach. You can't address everything all at once, but you can address your highest risks. So if I give you an example of how far down the supply chain we went, when I mentioned that article by The Guardian, and that was later picked up by Associated Press, they were talking about the vessels that were at sea supplying fish that went to fish meal. So that was actually in our 7th tier. So we had to go with a processor and back to the farm and back to the feed mill and then back to the feed producer and then back to the fish meal producer. And then we started doing the audits of vessels that were providing the fish that went into fish meal. So where it's a hugely high risk area, I think you need to go all the way along the supply chain. Where perhaps it isn't your highest risk, maybe don't start with that in the first year, because I will say you can't boil the ocean. You can't do everything all at once, but you can definitely get a handle on those high risk areas.
Thanks, Darren. Shelley, did you have any sort of reflections from your experience on that as well?
Mainly just to absolutely agree with Darian on that point. It's much better to do a deep dive into your highest risk areas than it is to do a shallow dive across your all of your supply chains. And again, if you find that 7 tiers down there are really significant practices, then it might be time to consider your procurement, reconsider the procurement practices and what your relationship is, why it is that there are so many steps and why you weren't able to get that information, why you didn't have that information already about the practices in your highest risk supply chains.
Thanks, Shelley. Kerry, did you want to make a comment?
Just to quickly add, in thinking about risk, it's not simply, of course, but to reinforce the point that it's not simply about when you're thinking about your suppliers and your supply chain, where the largest spend is. In taking a risk-based approach, that may be helpful in differentiating and prioritising, but it's also thinking through and overlaying a number of data points. So that might be country of origin, end product, end supplier, etc., in order to reach an informed view on where those risks really lie.
Great, thank you. Shelley, perhaps this question might be a bit close to home, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it relates to the university sector. University and higher education being a significant export of the Australian economy. Just wouldn't mind some insights. How is the university sector, both in Australia and overseas, dealing with modern slavery reporting?
So I don't have a fantastic overview yet, but I can tell you about a few universities where I know of their practices, and they started a couple of years ago. As soon as it was clear that the Modern Slavery Act was going to be passed, and they were able to do that because they already had sustainability sections. So University of New South Wales, Monash and RMIT all have modern slavery committees. They have to report to the highest level of the universities, and there's been pretty significant buy-in, from the Vice Chancellor and University Council level, and they've undertaken very significant reviews of the procurement practices. I don't know what's happening in other universities, but certainly because they're such big sectors, because they buy in a huge number and range of services and goods, there are likely to be a wide range of risks that will be reported on and addressed. But I think a few of them will be quite good kind of statements to look at if you're hoping to find a good example.
Thanks, Shelley. Darren, I might put this question to you. Obviously, you've got a depth of experience in agriculture at Thai Union. One of Australia's other biggest sectors is resources, energy and resources and the like. I wouldn't mind just your sort of first thoughts on some of our larger organisations and how they might go about trying to identify where there might be modern slavery risks in their supply chain.
Thanks, Rami. So whilst I haven't worked with the Australian resources sector, there were certainly some of the leaders in this, because they recognised, particularly from a human rights perspective, that they needed to cover off when it came to free, prior, informed consent and accessing different land. So they've been working on human rights for a number of years. It's a slight pivot to looking at their Modern Slavery Act statements, but I know I've heard Andrew Forrest talk about when he first came to the realization that there could be slavery at some point in his supply chain, and it really sparked a whole transformation within his organization, but also inspiration for what the Minderoo Foundation were doing. And so I think there are some leading practices there, but possibly, like everybody else, there's also some catching up to do.
Great, thanks, Jarian. Shelley, Kerry, any sort of comments in relation to energy and resources you'd like to make?
Perhaps just to quickly say that, again, our biggest resource companies have reported under the UK Act. It is possible to have a look at those statements and see the development over the period of reporting, to see the way that their reporting has improved and a reflection on the processes that they have developed, and where they've admitted that there are modern slavery risks or incidents of modern slavery in their supply chains.
Great, thank you. We are just about out of time. I want to thank everybody, our panellists and our attendees today, for coming to this webinar. Our panellists have kindly given up their time and presenting on a topic that I'm certain you're all going to take to heart. It's obviously really relevant at the moment with COVID-19, and it might in fact increase the vulnerability of workers in your global supply chain, perhaps even in Australia. Modern slavery statements are new. So if you have any questions, please contact Shine Australia. If you follow our LinkedIn page, you'll get a feel for the work we're doing and some of the insights about our upcoming seminars. Before we conclude, there is a short survey that we'd like you to complete. Could I ask you to please do that once your screen closes? Be well, stay healthy, and thank you. Speak to you soon. Bye.